Welcome to the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, and today I'm here at Menn Law offices in Appleton, Wisconsin, and this is the first of several conversations that we're going to have coming up that address some of the topics that are on the hearts and the minds of our dairy farmers, and those are topics related to transition planning and succession planning, things like trusts, looking at how to set up their estates, even things like divorce and prenups, and that's what we're going to be digging into with an expert in the field who actually comes from the farm fields of Western Illinois himself, Mr. Will McKinley here at Menn Law, president of Menn Law.
That's right. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this side of the microphone as opposed to just listening. So thanks for letting me hang out with you today, Peggy. It's great.
Well, absolutely, Will. And one of the reasons that I wanted to bring you in to serve our listeners here at Uplevel Dairy Podcast is that you have a wealth of knowledge and expertise within Menn Law and yourself in working with farms and agribusinesses on these topics that are pressing on the minds of our farmers. And Menn Law may be a name that is new to some of our listeners. However, it ties back to a name and a firm that is well established and reputable, especially in our dairy communities. And that's the office of George Tuig.
That's right.
And so do you want to just take a minute and explain the relationship between Menn and Tuig Law Firm?
Sure. So Menn Law Firm has been around for almost 100 years. So we've been a very long-standing law firm based in Northeast Wisconsin, but we have a statewide presence. We represent clients all over the state of Wisconsin and outside of Wisconsin too. Our law firm has historically worked alongside or worked with the law firm of Tuig, Rietbrock, Schneider, and Halbach. Law firms love to have really long, obnoxious names. So that's why we're Menn Law Firm. We just picked one as opposed to having a string of them. But yeah, so we worked with the Tuig firm, and many people are familiar with that law firm in ag because that's what their whole thing is, attorneys for agriculture. That's what George Tuig, who's been practicing for over 50 years and will continue practicing for another 50 if he has his way, that's what his focus was. And so as our two firms have worked together historically, like many businesses, what their firm was encountering was difficulty hiring. They were having difficulty, as George Tuig would say, getting people to want to come to Hooterville and work in Hooterville at their law firm. So recruiting young lawyers, recruiting paralegals, legal assistants. Because our two firms have worked together historically, a decision was made, well, let's stop living in sin and let's get hitched. So we officially got married at the beginning of the year and have been, now we're one firm. And so we are under the Menn Law Firm name, but nothing has changed otherwise in terms of the attorneys with that firm and the quality legal service. But what the affiliation has done is it's now ensured that the legacy that was established by George and his team can continue on for the next generation, which is really, really exciting. So our law firm, in addition to providing the estate planning and the business guidance that their firm has always done with farmers, we now can also provide additional things like if someone's going through a divorce, or if there's a litigation, you're being sued or you're needing to sue someone, or you're having difficulty with insurance issues or those types of more kind of complex legal things. Our law firm can provide assistance with that. So it's nice because now you can be a one-stop shop for all of your legal needs. And so again, we have an ag business legal department that consists of a number of attorneys, and we look forward to continuing to serve farmers in the many years to come.
Yeah, and we're going to get into what some of those ways are that you serve farmers and your experiences and expertise on some specific topics in a minute here. Yep. But I want to just take a minute to get to know you a little bit more, sure. Will. And
I'm really not that interesting, so actually, we can move on to the next.
You kind of are. I disagree. In the few conversations I've had with you, Will, I found you quite interesting. And in fact, I want to hone in on the fact that when you talk about the agribusiness model that George Tuig had built with his firm there in Chilton, that really isn't far from your roots and where you came from, because you're a farm kid at heart too. So tell us about your ag roots.
So I'm a 4-H kid, but I grew up, as you kind of mentioned, I grew up in Western Illinois. I grew up in a really small town, 900 people. My graduating class was 32 kids, public school. My parents were not farmers, but everyone else in my family is, all grain farmers and some beef. So I was the weird 4-H kid that did the non-farm thing. So I was like the gardening nerd and the photography nerd because I, of course, didn't have beef to show or hogs to show, but still grew up with 4-H and in that small kind of rural community. And that's always, anyone who grew up in a small town, anyone who grew up on a farm, you can leave it, but it never leaves you. It's always kind of there. And so I ended up in Wisconsin because I went to Marquette for undergrad, and my wife Gretchen is from Appleton, and so then went to law school at Marquette, ended up in Northeast Wisconsin, because although there are lots of farming opportunities in Western Illinois, there are not very many legal opportunities in Western Illinois. So ended up here in this part of the state. But it's been great because as with this affiliation, it's now allowed me to really be able to focus a large part of my practice on ag business, on farm, which is great because now it's almost like a homecoming of sorts, because I'm now getting to kind of work with people that have kind of that similar upbringing, similar background, similar values. And it's great. Very rewarding.
And so you've been able to tie in your upbringing
Yep.
and where you came from with what you're doing now. And you have a lot of experience in different types of law industries and law. And that's a huge value, I believe, to agriculture, that you come from it, you know the values, you know the roots and traditions, but you also have some outside experience. And the farmers that I talk with, they're looking at how can we tap into the experiences and the successes in other industries and bring that into our large, growing and expanding dairy farming businesses from a legal perspective, from a transition planning perspective. Do you want to maybe just elaborate too on some of the industries that you specialized in?
Yeah, so before really jumping in and committing full-time to ag, in my prior kind of experience, I worked actually a lot in medical and dental. That was the legal space for the types of clients that I worked with. And very different industries, although dentists love white, as do dairy farmers, just different kind of white gold when teeth and milk. But nevertheless, the type of business model and the considerations. And what's interesting is you represent dentists, they're focused on making as much money as they can make and then selling their practice and retiring. Farmers are the complete opposite. They're there for life, and their focus is simply, how do I get this business, this living organism, onto the next generation, which I love because it's such a more meaningful, not that I don't enjoy working with dentists, but it's a very different just philosophy in terms of what you're trying to accomplish from a planning perspective. So worked a lot in medical, in dental, also worked a fair amount in manufacturing and representing kind of small, metal shops, metal fab producers, those types of things. So you're right. It's interesting because dairies who are progressive, those who are looking to survive in the 21st century and continue on for the next generation, they are having to think outside of the box. They're having to look at things. And frankly, dairies have, like it or not, they've become a lot more corporate. And I don't mean that in a derogatory term. I just mean they're bigger, and therefore the considerations they have to keep in mind from HR compliance, immigration compliance, regulatory compliance, tax compliance, all of these things that maybe 20 years ago weren't a big deal when you were milking 300, 400 head. Well, now they're very big deals, and they're really no different than any other manufacturing business or anything else. And so it is good. I feel like I do kind of come in with just some outside perspectives that, for nothing else, can provide some insights to farm owners as they're kind of trying to navigate this new world that we're all operating in.
So you take these different layers of your experiences, Will, and I'm going to add one more to that.
Yep.
And that's that over the last year or so, you have spent an incredible amount of time with George Tuig,
Yep.
learning George's insides and outs
Yep.
of how he has been working with farms so closely, and the things that he has done that have really just made him a leader in that field of family farm transition and succession. And that's who you have been spending your time with.
Yeah, very much so.
What's it been like hanging out with George for the last year?
I've actually been asked that question by a lot of people. Working with George has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my career. So he always says, farming is a religion. right? And it's true. For farmers, it's a religion. It's not just a job. It's not even a vocation. It is a religion. It's a faith, and it requires that kind of commitment. So if farming is a religion, he would be like at least a bishop or a cardinal when it comes to the faith. And so working with him and not just learning, obviously, I've been practicing for 15 years. So there's no matter what industry you're working in, there are certain legal things, principles that are the same. There are a lot of nuances. So there's been a lot of learning of the nuances. But it's really more learning the philosophy and the art of approaching what are many times very difficult conversations, but also really complex issues and trying to break those down. I have the privilege of traveling with him. I routinely introduce myself as his lackey. I was in Marshfield last week meeting with a couple of farm families as they're working through some various issues. And so it really is an honor because, again, he has committed his career to agriculture as a lawyer, as a service provider to farmers. And so to be able to help continue with that legacy and adopt those same kind of values and ethics that he has, it's a privilege. It very much is. And it's also very rewarding because, again, it's like having a law professor at your disposal to learn from on a daily basis.
And as you have been going out with George and really just diving in with all your hands and feet into working with farms on the things that they face every day, one of the big ones that comes up time and time again is the subject of transition planning. Mm-hmm. And the piece that I want to focus on for our conversation today, Will, and to tap into some of your experiences and expertise here is it's kind of the beginning stages. And by beginning stages, this is what I hear so often from farm families is that they have maybe those initial conversations. Maybe they've called you, you've been out there, you've had a couple of meetings, and then all of a sudden, on your end, it's crickets. Something stopped, something happened or didn't happen, but there's a stalling and a pause in the process. How often does this happen?
Yeah, so I actually was having a conversation about this with a colleague of mine who also does a lot of ag planning here at the firm. And I call it the micro stall and the macro stall. Mm. So what I mean by that is I use the dental example. Someone who owns a dental practice, they work, and when they're ready to retire, they sell it. They take that money, they go buy a Speedo and move to Boca. That's what they do. Farmers don't do that.
No, because they don't wear Speedos.
They don't wear Speedos, mercifully. But also, they don't retire. And so one thing George always says is, look, if you're going to get the farm, you're going to get grandma and grandpa and the one-eyed dog along with it, because grandma and grandpa are going to continue to linger until they don't, right? So the difficulty becomes with farmers and with you take your kind of current generation and you're looking to transition to the next generation. There's this kind of feeling by the first generation of, well, I'm not ready to transition because I'm not ready to retire, because if I retire, I'm going to die. I mean, that's the mindset psychologically. And so really what it stalls is that kind of, I'm not ready to retire. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to think about this. And so what happens is over the years, and so this is the macro stalling where it's more globally, it's that we start to talk about it as a family and then we put it off. And usually we start talking about it when an uncle dies or an aunt dies or grandma dies or someone dies or something happens and we find out our neighbor got cancer. Ooh, we should probably be thinking about this. And then it just kind of it languishes. Then, and part of that is also attributable to the nature of farming. Mm-hmm. So farming, especially dairy farming, it's very cyclical, right? So you have some downtime where you have the luxury of maybe sitting around and thinking it's a rainy day. Okay, I'm going to sit around and maybe we need to get our affairs in order type thing. Well, now we're busy planting. Well, now we're busy spraying and now we're busy chopping and now we're busy doing this or busy that. And so it's very easy then in light of that to just push it off. Then the micro stalling occurs when we finally get a client to reach out and we will have that initial meeting where it's really this type of planning, these types of conversations usually involve 3 to 4 meetings because they involve starting off high level and then really getting into the details and then bringing in the affected parties, the kids or whomever, to then get them on. So it requires a lot of steps. And again, getting back to the cycle of farming, life gets busy. And so as a lawyer, I always say I'm minimally invasive, meaning I'm not going to sit here and browbeat you to come into my office and talk about things if you're not ready. I'm not going to harass you. What I try to do is when we start this process, we actually set a schedule and we try to schedule those meetings out so we're working towards them. But it's difficult. And on the flip side, a lot of attorneys who don't, I'm not going to say they don't work in this space, but they don't necessarily appreciate the religious nature of farming and how involved and complicated it can be. They'll just say, okay, well, here's your documents, sign them. And that's like the worst thing that could possibly happen. And we can talk about that at a different time. But the point is, because it is complicated and it's so involved, it is very easy for it to just get put off. And so that's why I always say in that first conversation, are you committed and are you ready to do this? Because it is complicated and it requires a time commitment on their part, both to do the process, but also to mentally be like, okay, I'm here, I'm ready, this is important. So what that usually means is a lot of pushing from the second generation, from the up and comers, for them to be the catalyst and the prod to make it happen. Because like it or not, mom and dad aren't necessarily going to do that because, again, it's difficult. It's a very difficult conversation to have.
What you've identified here, Will, is a couple of these key underlying reasons of why the process hits a stopping point, a halting point, a pause button. And you've brought up that sometimes maybe it relates back to the why did they make the call in the first place? Perhaps it was something that happened that just kind of sparked a thought, right? But maybe they weren't quite ready to make the commitments to keep that process moving. Or maybe that there was something that happened, an event that happened that was a catalyst for that. But what I'm hearing from you is that within this, we also need to see that parties are pushing things forward and that there are people within the family that want to see that moving and that are going to hold the commitment that you help them make. And that's to having a schedule for the next steps, the next meetings.
Yes.
So that's your way to keep things moving forward, is to schedule those meetings.
Yeah, we try to. And of course, it's difficult because, again, farming, it's not like a 9-to-5 job. And so to say, well, we're going to schedule this meeting in June. Well, then June happens. And because it's been so rainy, we finally have some good weather, we got to reschedule that meeting. And so it is tough because, again, if done right, this is not a process that is done in one meeting and then you're complete. That means that it hasn't been done right. In all honesty, this is a multi-step kind of conversation. And typically, I and my colleagues, the first meeting, especially if it's a newer client, we like to go meet on farm. It's important for us to it may not seem important, but it is for us to understand what we're dealing with. But more importantly, I think it's important, again, getting back to this is a religion. It's important for the client to be able to show off what they've built and to not have to say it, but just to be able to show how important it is to preserve what they've built and to make sure that goes on. So I think that's a very cathartic exercise for us to be there and meet on farm and at least once to be able to just kind of get that experience. And it just helps us get to know them as well.
And it shows you the respect that you have for what farm families have built.
For sure.
Just being able to be a part of it, to see it, to take it in, and to feel what that's like to be there.
Half of my meetings are either at the kitchen table, which is fantastic. I love it. Those are my favorites. Those are my favorite meetings when the whole family's sitting around.
That's just because grandma brings you cookies.
Well, that's true. Usually there's always milk and cheese and some sort of sweet involved, which is great. But the flip side is a lot of times our meetings are with like the lender or the accountant. So we're meeting at their office equally as well, which is, again, very much part of this process. And when you talk about things stalling, that it's complicated because, again, when we're talking about succession planning in particular, that involves lots of different parties. It involves the owners, it involves the up and coming owners, it involves the non-farm kids, right? What are we going to do with them? And how are they going to be involved in this? It involves the lender. It involves the accountant. It involves, in many cases, sometimes the farm finance guy, the number crunching guy, because they tell us financially, how can we structure things? So there's a lot of people involved in the conversation, and there are a lot of conversations. It's a big time commitment, but it's an incredibly important time commitment as well.
Getting back to our conversation today about the stopping and the stalling of this process, any stories that you can share? You've been getting your feet pretty wet in this space for a while now. A good story that you can share that we can all take home a lesson from when it comes to a farm or a family you've worked with where there's been a stall.
Yep.
And what was going on and what you were able to do to help them get on the other side of that.
Sure. A good one that comes to mind is family farm in southern Wisconsin, two brothers. And so there's two brothers that co-own it. And then both brothers have children, some who are on farm somewhat, some who are not. And that's complicated because the question is, okay, well, both brothers are still, alive and kicking, great. But once one of them gorks out or dies, then we got a problem because what's going to happen to their ownership? And are we allowing non-farm kids to get involved? Are we allowing the kind of farming kids to get involved? Mm-hmm. And so what happens is we have a family meeting and husbands and wives and interested parties are there. And we pose questions that are difficult questions because they have to be answered. Because remember, we have a partnership. Both of these guys have to agree, right, for it to work. And there wasn't quite an agreement. And they didn't realize that there wasn't quite an agreement until that kind of conversation was had. And so, like many farmers, confrontation is something that tends to be avoided, right? Farmers don't like confrontation. They just want to show up and do their work and move on with life, and they don't want to deal with it. And moms really don't like confrontation, especially when it involves their kids or it involves their grandkids. Mm-hmm. So in that circumstance, what happened was when we discovered that there wasn't quite a meeting of the minds, the parties just kind of shut down and they just decided to ignore it. And so what ultimately happened was, and again, I don't tend to babysit, I don't tend to force, but I have a process where we tend to follow up like every 6 weeks and say, hey, Will's calendar is really busy. Should we get another meeting? Just a kind of like a friendly reminder, we need to get this done. And finally ended up what happened was, in that circumstance, had one-on-one conversations with each brother, just separate so they could speak their mind and speak freely. And what ended up happening was in those conversations, I discovered that really there wasn't a disagreement so much as there just was confusion as to what expectations there were, and was able to mediate that misunderstanding to get to a point where we were able to find like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. We can do it this way, and it eliminates the concern. And once I was able to get past that, then it was very easy. We were able to schedule another kind of follow-up meeting. We got all the questions answered that I needed, and we were able to get the plan finalized, and I'll be going down in a couple of weeks to get all that signed off. So again, if I hadn't pressed the issue in a certain respect, this would have just stalled. It would have just died on the vine because they just didn't want to have to deal with the awkwardness of having that conversation. So a large part of what I do, and this is we were talking about George, a big part of what he does in his practice is really kind of family mediation. It's helping people comfortably talk through concerns so that we understand what's going on below the level or below the surface, so that we can then say, that's fine. We can work around that. It's okay that you maybe have this concern. We can address that and solve that for you so that we're not preventing the total thing from being, figured out and moved on. So that's just one example of how these, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners are hearing that story and going, oh yeah, I can imagine that with my sibling or with my dad or whatever. But it just requires a willingness to share and to communicate. And again, sometimes that requires just one-on-one conversations where you don't have to be the bad guy. You don't have to be the one saying things in a meeting with everyone sitting around the table. We can do it privately, and I can then navigate that to make sure those concerns are addressed.
Will, when you describe this scenario,
Mhm.
something that stands out to me in this one too, that I think is going to be very relatable as well, is it's the assumptions,
Yep.
right? And just the reality of our agriculture and our way of being,
Yep.
that we can work next to someone all day long, have lunch with them at the big kitchen table
Yep.
every day, but not truly have conversations that are open about maybe what we really want or what expectations might be there. And in this scenario that you mentioned, there was a disconnect between what one of the brothers had in mind and what the other one. At the end of the day, it wasn't that they were that far
Nope.
apart, but the stalling came from just being siloed in their own thoughts. And prior to you stepping in and intervening and mediating, that was the thing that could have prevented them making the next right move forward. And so in your role, the many things that you're able to do was to be able to be that person that
Yeah.
took them one-on-one
Right.
and help them articulate what they actually wanted so that you could come together.
Yeah, it's the fear of confrontation that generally, that avoidance of confrontation, which then prevents them from really speaking or articulating what they want. And so then it's just to avoid the conversation, because they don't want to get into an argument with their brother or whatever it might be. So they just don't want to have the conversation. My job is to say, okay, well, you don't have to have that conversation. You have it with me. And then I will spin it in a way that we can get to where you want to be. Because they're always concerned they're going to say it the wrong way, or they're going to offend sister-in-law or something like that. And it gets complicated, because think about it. Either we have this situation, or we have friends or family members we know. You have brothers that run the farm or whatever it is, and one brother has a child that is kind of a nincompoop. They work on the farm, but there is no way that they are going to be able to run this thing. But dad or mom, a lot of times it's more mom, thinks that child should own a part of the farm. And so other brother, partner, it's like, I don't want to be partners with him. Well, how do you say that? I mean, honestly, how do you at a meeting articulate, I think I think my nephew's a nincompoop and I don't want to be partners with him. That makes for a very awkward Thanksgiving, understandably. So me being able to help navigate that and be able to kind of set things up where it's less about personal attack. It's more about, how do we set qualifications to be eligible so that it's not just him, it's anyone, any qualified person who's coming up in the ranks. So you almost make him ineligible by setting ground rules that say there's no way he can achieve these kind of metrics. So there's things, again, that we can do as lawyers, but we have to understand. I always say, if you really want to understand what a farmer's thinking, you go talk to the guy that's running the scale at the elevator, because he's the only one that usually gets the inside scoop as to what's going on. That's kind of the chief confidant. So for me, a lot of this is psychology. It's, what are you thinking? What are you really thinking? And then how can we work within that?
I want to just pull apart some takeaways for anybody that's listening that can relate to pieces and parts of the scenarios that you've outlined. And a couple of them, what they are, is that when families are hitting a stalling process,
Yep.
and perhaps it's because they are feeling like they can't be open about what they want, or maybe need some help articulating that. The action step here is there are people like you that are willing to mediate and to help draw out those conversations, because you can't move forward without them, right?
Correct.
And the other piece and part that I want to pull out here too, in the scenario where you're talking about this family dynamic, and perhaps there's, a child that some family members want to see become an owner, but other family members are saying, I don't want to own a business with them. This is common, right?
Oh.
And that's okay to have those thoughts and to not want to enter into something that you don't feel 100% confident in, but bring in someone that has experience with the dynamics of family and farming and business, and can help put in place the structure for a system and for decision making that removes emotion from the conversations, but also takes a little bit of, I would say, almost a little bit of heat off of the family
Right.
of being the bad guy for saying, I don't want to work with this person. I don't want to own a business with this person. And you can be the bad, I don't want to call you a bad guy. You're too nice to be a
No,
bad
we
guy.
always
Well,
say
but
you can blame your lawyer, your accountant, or your banker. Anytime someone has bad news and they don't want to have to, say something that's going to offend someone, blame your lawyer, your accountant, your banker. I always prefer the banker, but
yeah,
that's okay. You can blame the lawyer too.
But you'll take it, right? You'll take it because you're committed to the bigger picture.
Correct.
Right? Like you will take that blame because you're
Correct.
committed to the bigger picture of helping this family see through to whatever their desired end result
Right.
can be. And so I hope those are a couple of the takeaways
Yeah.
that others can gain from the examples that you shared. And a lot of it comes back to not having to do this by themselves.
Correct.
And just looking at who are the resources within the industry, the people like you, Will, that have really dedicated their business to being able to help farm families through these things. Any other takeaways and drive home points that you want to make sure people get from this conversation?
You summarized it. It's complicated, heavy stuff. I mean, it's emotionally heavy. It's legally heavy in the sense of how do you go about doing it. There's tax, lots and lots of tax considerations. There's financial considerations. And so when we say, well, why do people stall? A lot of times it's because it's just overwhelming.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be. And you work with me, you work with one of my colleagues. We help make it so it's not overwhelming. That's our job. That's what we're here for. And we enjoy doing that. We enjoy helping people work through that process and making it so that it's simplified. And so we're a resource for that. And there are times people call and they're just not ready to jump into it yet. And that's fine. That's totally understandable. There are also times when people call and it's almost too late. They've made commitments, they've said things, and then we're too far. So it's always better if you think you're at a point where you feel like you at least want to understand what could this look like. That's the best time to have that initial conversation, because at least then you can start to understand, what does this process entail? How long does it take? How expensive is it going to be? What are my options? There are so many options out there that everyone just thinks, well, I have to buy the farm or I have to sell the farm. No. There's so many things we can do that can accomplish goals in a much better manner. Going on Google and doing your own legal work is not advised. Let's just put it that way. So we're happy to be a resource because, again, we understand the psychology. I'm not going to say we understand the psychology, but we appreciate the psychology that goes into this that is different than in other industries.
Yeah. And that's why I appreciate you, Will, and your desire to want to serve the dairy community and the farming community. And that's, again, why we're having this conversation. Right. And I want people to know what Menn Law is doing and the depth in your team of knowledge and experience in agribusiness, but also your ability to help serve beyond the traditional transition planning needs, but into some of the other legal services. Because as you had alluded to earlier in your manufacturing experience, farms have so many more needs.
Yes.
And whether it's as they're buying and selling land or expanding the business or selling off a division or whatever they're in, it's immigration, it's OSHA, it's all of these things and taxes, like just a few examples, but all of those things are under different umbrellas within Menn Law. Absolutely. As well. And so one-stop shop.
We are a one-stop resource that, again, we're here, we're part of your team. We view ourselves no different than your agronomist, or your banker, your accountant. We're part of your team. And that's why we want to get to know you. We want to understand what your mission, your values, what drives you and what you're looking for, because then we can make sure we've got your back. That's what we're here for.
Yeah. And your service area includes what region?
So we represent farmers throughout Wisconsin, certainly happy to work with folks in other states as well. There are some things we can't do, but that doesn't prevent us from helping because we just work with local lawyers who can do the things that, the few things that we can't, whether it's some real estate and there's some other regulatory things that we can assist with. But we are very proud and happy to work with as many farmers who are looking for assistance and would like to work with us.
Excellent. And it is so challenging to find people that have the depth and knowledge of experience in dairy specifically, because it is a different type of business, a different type of farming business. And again, this is why I'm so glad that we can have this conversation. I can bring you to our listeners of Uplevel Dairy as a stacked resource in the dairy space for those conversations. And Will, we've been able to dig into some of your expertise in the time we've had together today, but because you're going to be coming back with us for a few more episodes.
If you'll have me, unless the ratings tank, and then I'm out. If I'm bumped.
Then you get bumped. Well, if you don't get bumped, which by the way, so I just want to also invite any of our listeners that have specific questions that they want to hear you give some response to, that they can definitely shoot me a message at peggy@upleveldairy.com or DM me through Instagram or Facebook or whatever. But we want to make sure that we're addressing the thoughts and the questions that our dairy people have.
You and I can kibitz all day about whatever, but obviously there's some things, that are very nuanced questions that would be boring and probably not appropriate, but just the high level stuff. It's always good for us to be able to speak to specific questions.
Yes, absolutely. And so that invitation stands for all of our listeners to hit me up with a message so that we can tap into Will and his expertise. And if you haven't figured it out, a little bit of his comedic relief as well. And okay, so Will, I am not letting you off of this podcast until I ask you 5 questions.
I was hoping we ran out of time. We wouldn't have to get to this.
No, these are my favorite.
I know.
And Uplevel Dairy listeners, they know that I have 5 questions that I love to ask people to get to know more about Will, not just lawyer Will, but who you are, how you think, what makes you tick.
Sure.
Uplevel 5. Question number 1 that I have for you, Will. What does success look like to you?
That's a tricky question. If we're talking global success, I think for me, success would be that at the end of the day, when I die at 104, I leave a legacy of a family that feels that I was a good father and provider for them, and colleagues that feel I was a good partner, and clients that felt like I added value to their business or their personal lives. That would be success for me.
Oh, that's great. Okay, you mentioned family.
Yes.
You have a big one.
I have a big one. I have 5 kids, 4 boys, 1 daughter. Oldest is 16, youngest is 6, and they're about 2 years apart.
Whew.
My wife's a stay-at-home mom, and she's got the hardest job on the earth.
And she's a saint.
Even harder than a dairy farmer. Promise you.
Oh, all right. In 3 words, Will, how do you want to show up each day?
Ready, willing, and able.
Ready, willing, and able.
No
play on the word.
No play on words.
Will.
No, I'm ready to show up and do my job. I'm willing to do whatever is needed of me. And physically and psychologically and emotionally, I'm able to do it.
All right.
That's a good day.
I heard you say physically, so that means that you're eligible for covering the silage pile.
Yeah, right. No, I detasseled corn. That was good enough.
All right. You were fine. You earned your cred. Okay. Question number 3. Who are the thought leaders that you follow?
I'm going to say my wife. I'm going to say my priest. And then I'm really partial. This is going to make me... I like Bill O'Reilly. I've always liked Bill O'Reilly as a political commentator, but also a legal commentator. I just enjoy his pragmatism in life. So I would say Bill O'Reilly as well. Oh. Megyn Kelly, I also like her. So apparently I like all the Fox News dropouts. Those are the people I like. Enjoyable to listen. And Peggy, of course, you're a thought leader as well. I have to add you to the list.
I'm not the thought leader. I just talk to the smart people. That's what I do.
Or those who can feign it. So,
what are the words you live by?
This is going to make me such a dork. I've always loved the expression manifest destiny. Obviously an American political, sometimes criticized philosophy. But for me, it's more of if you imagine that you're going to do it, then you're going to do it. Like you're going to make it work. You're going to make it happen. And so that's something that for me has always been one of those, again, growing up in a small town in the cornfields of Western Illinois. This is what I want my life to be. And then just making it happen. Wow. Manifest destiny. I think there are a lot of people out there that live, they maybe call it something else, but that's what it is. This is what I want and I'm going to make it work. I'm going to make it happen. It may take a long time, but I'm going to get there.
Okay. So question number 5 is piggyback off of that. Then what's your next up level? What's the next manifestation of your destiny that you're working on right now, Will?
I would love to go into a weekend with a 0 on my email inbox.
Whoa.
If I could just if I could go into a weekend without having to worry about, I didn't respond to emails. No, For me, at the phase I am in my life right now with little kids at home, my next up level is literally to just get them out into the world. That would be that is my up level. I want them to be productive members of society out the gate.
Well, Will, I tell you, it has been insightful and also fun to sit down with you today and to have a fun conversation about you, but more importantly, a conversation that's going to relate to so many of the people that I know in the dairy community on one of the topics that is near and dear to their hearts that's causing stress and strain. And hopefully we've left our listeners with a few takeaways for if they're in that spot where they've been stuck in some of their transition planning phase, that they feel a little bit more empowered, have another tool, have another connection, see the next right step to keep that process moving forward.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was super fun, and I look forward to coming back and having some more fun with you.
Excellent. And in the meantime, if you have questions for Will or want to reach out to Menn Law, know more about the services there, I'll have a link in the show notes. And again, hit me up with a message of what you'd like to hear Will share more about as well. But best way for people to get a hold of you and the team here at Menn Law?
You can call 920-731-6631 if you prefer phone. Otherwise, you can email me. My email is William-McKinley at Menn, MENN law.com.
Perfect. And that'll all be in the show notes as well. So, all right. Well, thanks for jumping onto the Uplevel Dairy Podcast.
Have a good one.
All right. Thanks, Will.